Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 161. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Daniel Powell about his latest book, Found Memories. This short story collection was inspired by Daniel's collection of old photographs. He began collecting old photos 7 or 8 years ago when he walked into an antique shop and saw a few photographs that were so intriguing he couldn't leave them behind. Daniel is quick to point out that these are not artistic photos. They are simply snapshots of other people's lives, taken in everyday situations, and Daniel began to wonder at the stories behind them. Being the writer that he is, he made up stories to fit the photos, and the result is Found Memories, his new collection of short stories. In this episode, I'll chat with Daniel about his writing journey, how he was never a collector of anything until he found those first photographs, and how this short story collection has challenged him and allowed him to grow as a writer, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Daniel Powell, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
I'm happy to be back.
I thought what we could do today is talk about your latest book. The last time you visited, we talked about your middle grade novel, Paper Birds and Other Flying Objects. This time around, you have a new collection of short stories called Found Memories. If you don't mind, tell us a bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Found Memories is a short story collection, and it's one where each story is inspired by a found photograph. I have this small but really compelling collection of old, mostly black and white photographs that I've been slowly building for a little while now. And I'll take a photo from the collection and sit with it for a little while and let it speak to me. I'll let it inspire a fictional story based on what I see there. It could be the person in the photograph or the people in the photograph, an expression on the person's face. It could be, something that's a landscape photograph, and there's just something that moves me based on my own memories of where I grew up or something I've experienced. And so that's where the project was first born, was just finding these photographs and holding on to them, and then experimenting with some new short stories based on what I saw in those images.
This collection of photos, where did you find them? How have you been collecting them, and how long have you been doing it?
It was 7 or 8 years ago when I walked into an antique shop for the first time since I was a kid, probably. And I don't even remember what I was doing there. Maybe I was looking for a unique lamp or a chair or something, but I'm not a collector. I say I collect these photographs, but again, it's a small collection. I'm not out there every day looking for these images. But other than that, at the time, I was not a collector. So I wasn't at the antique shop looking for anything to add to my collection of anything. And so I'm there and I stumble across this box of old photographs. And when I say old, I mean, most of them are before 1950s and 60s. And Most of them are black and white, as I mentioned. Some of them are in color, but those are sort of rare to find. And I'm looking through this box of photographs and finding some really unique, interesting, what are essentially just everyday people's snapshots. These aren't, fine art photographs or anything like that. These are just snapshots that people took with their little cameras. Could be family snapshots. Again, it could be the landscape where they were traveling, vacations. There were just a few in this box that stood out and were so intriguing that I couldn't just leave them there. I had to take them with me. And as you, I'm sure you know, and probably many of your listeners, if they are writers, know, our brains often want to turn everything into a story, right? I think the writer's brain wants to turn everything into a story, whether it's a photograph or whether it's something you see on the street, or I take morning walks and, I'll see something in someone's trash and want to turn that into a story. Sometimes I just cannot help it. So that's what I experienced with these old photographs. And so I thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to write a short story based on one of these photographs? And from there, it just kind of exploded. I started doing it. It kind of became the only thing I did for a little while. I also write for film and television, so I would kind of go back and forth between working on a script for something and this Found Memories project, and it just kind of snowballed, like I said.
And let's talk about how easy or difficult it was to craft a story from someone else's photograph. How easy or difficult was that? And were some easier than others?
Some were definitely easier than others. In the beginning, what was really fun and interesting to experience as a writer was that the stories did come really easily. When I would look at a photograph, it's not that the photograph sort of became my own. There's always a distance between me and the photograph. It may not be much of a difference, but there is a distance there that I wouldn't say I try to shorten that distance by writing the story, or that I need to shorten that distance in order to find my way into the story. But the earliest photographs were so intriguing that it wasn't hard to come up with a story. And this interesting thing would happen where, my own memories, or even just a feeling, an emotion that I've had would kind of meet that photograph halfway. And so I could then craft a narrative based on those two things kind of colliding in a very positive way. And so, it actually kind of surprised me how quickly and easily some of those earliest stories would emerge and evolve. And then as time went on, the process actually became more complex and more challenging in many ways, because I didn't consciously set out to make the stories longer or deeper or richer, or to include more history and a sense of place as much as they do now. But that's just kind of what naturally happened. I started to do more research. I would try to figure out, where this, not necessarily, I wasn't looking to know exactly like, where was this photograph taken, and is it local to me, or is it from somewhere else? Many of the photographs I do find locally, but I also like to look for photographs when I travel. So I do have some photographs from other places, but it wasn't so much a researching to find, again, specifics, but just to get a sense of, okay, what was happening at this particular time in this particular place, so that there could be some, not just authenticity to the story, even though they were fictional stories, but just a richer experience. And so, for example, there's a story in the book called Mythologies, and it's about two friends who look alike and can kind of pass themselves off as sisters, And they do at times, not in any sort of malicious way, but just simply, when people say, oh, you must be sisters, they just go along with that for their own reasons. So when I looked at that photograph and started thinking about time and place, I wanted to do some research. And so much of that story includes details related to literary figures like Ernest Hemingway and Wallace Stevens and Elizabeth Bishop, all people who lived or visited or had some connection to Florida. And so that story became a very Florida and literary centric piece in the book. And that was a lot of fun to do. It was, within my wheelhouse as far as writing and storytelling and literary figures. But again, I didn't want to have a detail in the story that would have actually been incorrect if someone were to fact check it. Now, that said, I also don't hold such a tight grip on that authenticity to where if someone were to say, well, that really wouldn't have happened, or that actually took place a decade later or something like that, I wouldn't lose sleep over that. But again, I wanted to make sure that if I interjected the story with something historical, that it was true or very close to being true.
Were there any photos that you struggled with telling the story? Any that where the story was just a little more elusive than the others? Like you knew it was there, but it was harder to pin down than some of the ones that came easy to you?
Well, I wouldn't say any one photograph was more difficult or elusive than another, simply because I tend to pick ones that really make me feel something intense. And that's both during the process of looking for them at an antique shop, for example, but also when I actually sit down to say, okay, this is the next one I'm going to write about. And so they're all very powerful in their own way. And so the reaction is pretty immediate and intense, like I said. So that helps the writing process start off pretty easily. The harder part comes when you're actually in the thick of writing the story, or when you've finished and you want to go back and make sure that it's everything it wants to be and everything you want it to be. But I'll also say that I wrote a number of news stories for the bound collection. I mentioned some stories have appeared in journals and magazines throughout the years, but I wanted to write a new set of stories just for the book. And so those stories were often ones that, unlike before when I was writing more intuitively, these new stories were ones that I had already formulated some idea about. And this was very new for me. And the reason why I had already formulated some idea about these stories is because I was sort of forced to take that approach by various opportunities that I was exploring. So as you might know, when you apply for grants or a fellowship or a writing residency, you have to submit an application. And in those applications, they often ask you to describe your work and to talk about what you see next for your work, and in particular, what you propose you will work on when you're at that writing residency or when you get that grant money. And so that's very different from what I'm used to. And so I have to then think about the work a lot more ahead of time and say, okay, what is this story going to be about, so that I can discuss it in an application like that. And so I had several photographs in mind for future stories, and I would use those as examples of what I wanted to work on if given an opportunity like a residency. And so before putting one word on the page, I would be looking at these photographs and formulating story ideas and characters and themes that I wanted those stories to explore. So I had a good idea of what I thought those new stories would be. So starting the writing process on those stories was very difficult because it worked against my normal process. And I already had an idea of where the stories might go, the themes they would touch on, and some of the formal devices I might use in those stories. And so it was this new experience for me as far as saying, okay, here's what I want to do. Here's what I've been talking about doing in these applications. And now I have to do it. And am I going to stick with that? And if the story wants to be something else, how much am I going to try to like fit it into the box that I had already built for it? Or am I going to let it kind of run free and do its own thing and do what it wants to do? And then also there was some research involved with one or two of those stories. And it was research that I knew well. In particular, there's a story called Helio, and I knew that it would involve historical elements having to do with photography and image making across time. And so I knew that well. As a filmmaker, I knew that history well, but I also wanted to get it very, very right on the page, and for the sake of the story, and also for, just being a filmmaker and wanting to explore that in a very accurate but nuanced way. And so there was more research involved, and there was an experience of writing that particular story that was a struggle because I had an idea in mind. And when I was trying to force that and it wasn't working, I had to open myself up and kind of try to get back to that more intuitive way of writing. And I had to embrace some uncertainty about what that would ultimately look like. I had to ask the question, well, if I write a different story, if I end up writing a different story than what I had originally proposed, and not just in the applications, but proposed to myself, then how am I going to feel about that? I guess I could say there were more voices in that writing process than I'm used to, if that makes sense.
Well, let's talk about how you curated the collection. So you have these photographs and you've written some stories, you're in the process of writing others. How do you decide what to include and what not to include? How do you decide what order in which to include them? What was that process like?
That process was really interesting, really fun, and also hard at times. This is my first story collection, and going through the stories and figuring out, okay, which ones still hold value for me. And I don't mean in terms of like being good or bad anymore, or, still being good, even though I wrote them years ago and I've grown as a writer and I'm doing much better writing in some ways. Those are sort of subjective things anyway, but it was more so just kind of like, now, how do they fit together? How do they speak to one another? Do I have 4 stories that kind of touch on the same theme, and is that okay? Or do I want to then make some cuts and say, well, let's pick the 2 strongest ones, or let's pick the 2 that, have a better conversation with the rest of the stories, rather than being, having 4 stories that are very much about X, Y, or Z. And so it was the decision to order the stories in the way they are in the book it occurred in various ways, and the choices were made based on a variety of factors. One thing I had in mind was, what are the stories about, and whose perspective are they told from? So the book tends to start out with stories that are either from the perspective of a child or children, and they sort of move forward in time to teenagers and young adults, into adult perspectives. Some of those adult perspectives are very much in the present for those characters, and sometimes those characters are looking back in the past, sometimes even back as far as childhood. And then toward the end of the book, we have stories that are very much about grown-ups, and there are children in some of those later stories, but for the most part, they are either the child version of the grown-up characters, or they are a child character in and of themselves, but the main protagonists of the story are adults. And so that was one way I decided to structure the book. I also wanted to pay close attention to the form of each story. So earlier I mentioned this idea of using certain formal devices to frame some of the stories in the book, and those devices often tend to be how I break up the story. So some of the stories have these moments where we break out and again have historical facts or details or examples of things in the real world that relate to what is taking place in these characters' lives. And so it's all there for a purpose. It's all intentional, but it is sort of a new and different way of telling these types of stories. And that was something I loved from the very beginning of this project of actually writing these stories based on photographs, is this idea that it gave me a lot of room to experiment. So I was doing a style of writing that I hadn't done before, and I was exploring narrative in a way that I had never done before, and in a way that I had never really seen before. And so that was really exciting because I grew as a writer because of that, but I could also play around, and if it worked, great, and if it didn't, no one had to see it. You know, I could pretty much put that story in the drawer along with the photo, you know, just like you would an old photograph, is just kind of tuck it away and no one has to see it, and you can pull it out years later and say, like, you know, laugh about it, or say like, oh, wait a minute, maybe there was something to this. And so not every story employs those kind of devices, but I would say about half of the stories in the book do. So I wanted to structure the sequence of the stories in a way where, if that form proved challenging to certain readers, that they wouldn't be overwhelmed by it, because there were other stories to kind of buffer that and give them a chance to have a more, I guess, traditional storytelling experience. So that was also something that I kept in mind. But I really love formalism in my own work and in the work of other people. And so when it makes sense for a story, then I'll certainly play around with it and see, you know, how well it works.
And now that the collection is done, looking at it, do you have any particular favorites? Either favorite photos that you've just, you like the photo, you knew you had to write about it, you're happy that it's now in the collection, or the resulting stories have become particular favorites? Any favorites? I know that's a hard question to ask, since most writers like everything equally.
Well, I will break away from that and say, yes, I do have favorites in the book. And it was we just talked about sequencing these stories, and that was another thing I kept in mind. Was I always knew the book would end with the two stories that it ends with, and they are my favorites for a number of reasons. But Helio is one where the photograph just grabbed me right away. Not only is it a great photograph of someone who was standing at a window and aiming the camera out into this courtyard area below. I've always loved windows, just for what they are and the light they bring into, you know, our houses. And when you study the history of windows, it's fascinating. But I also like them as framing devices in like movies and other motion pictures, and how they've been used in various ways over the course of movie making and even still photography. So I knew that the story would involve photography and motion pictures, and the history of image making, as I mentioned before. I knew it would include that going into the story. And as I wrote those applications for various opportunities, I always talked about it in that way as well. I couldn't see the story not exploring that. And then the final and maybe most important way the photo grabbed me is because it reminded me of View from the Window at Le Gras, which is the world's oldest surviving photograph, which I saw at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. I had seen that probably a few years before I came across this photograph that I use in the story. And that is a photograph through a window. And there are similarities between the two photos, but beyond the physical similarities, there's just a feeling and there's just a moment of humanity that I experienced looking at both of these photographs that just were so close to each other. I pretty much knew that the story would involve that detail as well. And it does. It was a really hard story to write, but it came together in a way that not only works well, but in a way that was successful in terms of what I set out to do. And then again, as a filmmaker, as someone who loves images and image making, I had a lot of fun incorporating my love of cinema and images into the story. And again, that was a challenging aspect because there are so many connections that I wanted to make between this character story. Her name is Helene. I wanted to make these connections between Helene's story and this larger story of why we make images and what we experience when we look at images. And of course, Found Memories being a project about photographs and about stories created from photographs, just the layers that are there were fascinating, but also sort of daunting to me because, I mean, with that story, it was something that I hadn't really done before. And then the last story in the book is called Graces, and it's a triptych. It's 3 interconnected stories that can also stand alone as individual stories, but I always knew that they would be connected, and I didn't quite know all the ways they would be connected, but I knew I had some idea of what I wanted to do with it. And when I sat down to write these 3 stories, I started and stopped several times. There were various versions and various approaches I tried to make with telling those stories. I mentioned before that knowing sort of what I was trying to do before I even tried to do it was quite challenging. Once I let go of that, kind of let go of the grip and said, okay, just start with the first one and, see where it goes, and then do the second one and see where that goes, and so on. And when I let go of it, and when I just enjoyed the process, while at the same time in the back of my mind, thinking, okay, these 3 stories, are going to be connected, and just having that there, it then eventually clicked, and it eventually started to flow really easily. And then it was a much different experience, and it worked out, and it became its own thing while also being what I hoped it would be from the very start.
And do you have more plans for short story collections in the future?
I love writing these found memory stories, it's something that I will always do in some form or another. I don't know if I'll have enough for another bound collection anytime soon, simply because, my writing time is now divided between other projects. Writing these short stories as easily as they might come, because the photographs are so compelling, they can be hard to do after I've worked on a television script or several television scripts over the course of, 6 months or a year. So coming back to a short story, like, those writing muscles tend to be very rusty, and getting back into it is the process is quite slow going at first. And then once the wheels sort of find their grip, it becomes easier and certainly more enjoyable in that sense. But starting a found memories story is harder these days. But I don't say that, as a way to say it's too hard to come back to, and so I don't want to work on the project. It's not that at all. It's just simply that when I do have the time to sit down with a photograph and write a story based on it, I want to be able to give it my undivided attention, and I want to be able to really get into it and do justice by what I find there and what I feel there. And it's, my time is not the same as it was when I first started the project.
Do you have any other goals as a writer? Anything else you want to do as an author?
I have a novel that I've been working on for some time now. I'd like to see it see the light of day, both in terms of completion, but also in terms of, having it be in book form for readers to experience. And it's very different from these stories, but also similar in terms of experimentation. I use fewer formal devices, but there's still a structure and a framework that presents the story in a way that I think is different from what most people might be used to, but it still comes from the same place. I just can't help that. It's me and my writing. It's the way I find my storytelling angle, if you will. The novel is something that needs to happen and will happen, but these funny things happen. Like I'll get another idea in mind, and it'll be, it'll just kind of hit me in a way that says, "Oh, you've got to do this right now," and it feels right, and I'll sort of go all in with it and say like, "Oh yeah, like this is what I want to work on right now." And so that's what I've been experiencing lately. Waking up and whatever writing time I have that day, I work on the project that wants to be worked on that day, whether it's because I had a great idea for a story idea during a morning walk, or a great line of dialogue for a character in a TV show, or if it's something about the novel, that's what I tend to work on that day. And that might seem to like a really inefficient way to get anything done, but for me, it works. I've actually done more work in the last 2 or 3 years than I had done in the 2 or 3 or 5 years prior to that. And part of that comes from just having a different perspective on life and writing, and even priorities. I have children now. I ended up having thyroid cancer 3 years ago, and I had surgery to remove that. And I'm cancer free and probably healthier now than I've ever been. And then, of course, we have the pandemic. So all these things sort of pushed me to not consciously reevaluate my goals as a writer and my perspective on my writing. But it was just kind of a very natural process to start to figure out, well, what is it that you're really saying with this work? What is it you're really doing with this work? And also, what do you like to experience as someone who reads books and watches movies and TV shows. And so, one thing that has changed over the last few years is just I don't want to expose myself to a lot of negativity, and that includes the art that I experience. And so if I know, and I do like to know ahead of time what I'm getting into with a particular book or a movie or a TV show, like a lot of drama and a lot of violence, I just can't do it. I could never really do a lot of violence before, but now, like, I want none of it. And so, I want to bring joy and peace through my work. And so because of that choice and because of that desire, I have found myself writing much more comedy these last few years, and the majority of my television scripts are comedies. And it's a lot of fun, of course, for obvious reasons, but it's also very rewarding because I know that if these stories are able to be shared with people, that there's a good chance they will bring joy to their lives as well, and bring them, even if it's a brief moment of laughter and, smiles and just a more positive experience. I think everyone has a right to make the art they make, but for me, I have a choice, right? And I have the freedom to tell my stories and to tell stories in the way I want to. And so that certainly has been a very conscious choice on my part to, take responsibility for the work I put out in the world, and to, try to affect other people's lives in a positive way, even if it's brief and temporary.
Well, if people want to learn more about you, find out about your projects, your books, things that you have going on, where should they go to find you and that information?
Everyone can find the book at bookswithbooks.com. There's more information about me there, but Found Memories, as well as Paper Birds and Other Flying Objects, are both available there.
Good. All right. Well, Daniel, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Found Memories and your work in progress, your novel coming up. We'll look for that. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you, Stacy. This has been a pleasure as always.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.